Ever since the mid-2010s, retro gaming has transitioned from a niche interest to a pretty popular hobby that's attracted both new and old gamers alike, and introduced tons to games that were relatively unheard of or have been completely forgotten about by the mainstream. Game prices have gone up due to popularity, companies have made accessories and enhancements bringing old hardware back from the dead, and certain franchises that were once trapped in the abyss of obscurity now have newfound relevancy thanks to either an active community of fans, memes, or an official revival. Retro gaming is currently bigger than it's ever been, and one of the biggest contributors to its resurgence was emulation. Now wait just a minute, if you're a longtime viewer of the channel, you might be thinking, didn't he already make a video about emulation not too long ago? That was back in April, right? Well, let's just say that video was absolutely terrible. I talked like a robot, the audio was atrocious, I didn't mention key things about the topic, I brought up Google Stadia for some reason, and I got shit wrong about PlayStation Plus. I want to make a new one. Anyway, back to the topic, emulation has been a gateway for so many individuals to discover an entire art form that was previously unavailable to them due to a variety of reasons. And while we can debate the morality of downloading ROMs without owning the game itself all day, my point I'm trying to make here is that the influence it can have on somebody new to the scene can shape their view on the medium greatly. Emulation can also be a great way to play games that are already available on current platforms due to it just being better in multiple ways. You can crank the resolution to HD, apply filters if you're a degenerate, use any controller you want, the works. Now, it's not exactly a wonderland of milk and honey though. Of course you need a copy of the game to run, and some consoles need a BIOS to be properly emulated. And if you got a stick up your ass and you want to do everything the legal way, it can be tedious and annoying just to get everything without downloading it. Not to mention, setting up a newly downloaded emulator is pretty time consuming if you want to just pick up and play a game. Sure, you don't have to tweak every single setting, but for the highest quality experience you'll definitely want to. And even if you're willing to change every single minute value to get a game working just right, some consoles still have trouble being emulated even now. The GameCube's premier emulator Dolphin is one of the greatest emulators ever made, but 6th-gen multiplats that weren't licensed kids games often skipped that console in favor of the Xbox and PS2, whose emulators aren't exactly in line with Dolphin. Since certain consoles are in a rough state in terms of unofficial emulation, for now we have to rely on various publishers involved to properly bring these games back to distribution, and in my opinion their efforts are just not good enough. Backwards compatibility has always been hit or miss each generation, with varying results coming from each side, but as time went on it just kinda got worse. Nowadays we have the PS5 and Xbox Series X. The PS5 supports most PS4 games, with PT purposely being made unplayable by Konami because fuck you. Sony recently updated PlayStation Plus with new tiers that give access to a bunch of games from different Sony consoles. Unfortunately, the PS1 emulation on these uses PAL ROMs with certain games with a hack that tries to replicate NTSC frame rates, but this introduces graphical corruption such as ghosting, and there's no option to render the games on the original 240p resolution with sharp pixels. Digital Foundry made a pretty good video on this specific emulator, and I highly recommend it. You can buy these games separately from PlayStation Plus, and correct me if I'm wrong, but PS1 Classics purchases on PS3 and Vita carry over as well, and wait. Toy Story 2 is on this? Okay, you know what? I take back everything I said. This is obviously a 10 out of 10 on our hands right here. This service is amazing. Who says PS5 has no games, huh? It's also worth noting that the PS2 emulation on this service uses the same underlying software used for PS2 Classics on PS4, which carries over its list of issues. Meanwhile, over at Microsoft, the Series X can basically do everything the Xbox One can, including playing all Xbox One games, accessing Xbox Game Pass, and the other Xbox consoles' games that are backwards compatible with the Xbox One. My fucking head hurts from saying Xbox so much. Both of these consoles have their ups and downs when it comes to backwards compatibility. Sony's emulation isn't the best, and some games that are on the PS3 store aren't on the PS5 store, and the PS3 games are all cloud streamed because Sony doesn't understand their own hardware, and the emulation on the other ones leaves a lot to be desired. With Xbox, while you can use original discs, which is a big plus, the actual amount of compatible games is not very high. You can play about a third of the 360 library, which is pretty impressive, but there's only about 70 original Xbox games that are compatible, with no word on the possibility of seeing any more. There's almost 1,000 games released for the original Xbox in North America, so having less than a tenth of the library be compatible really defeats the purpose if you ask me. The less we say about Nintendo, the better. Now, if you own the original discs to begin with, you likely own the original console as well, so why not use that, you might ask? Well, since these consoles are about 2 decades old now, the hardware is starting to show its age. It's time for me to talk trash about the PS2. Alright, put down the pitchforks, hear me out. This thing specifically uses a variety of resolutions for games, with a few shifting to lower resolutions for a second, which most modern TVs absolutely hate. These modern TVs only support these lower resolutions through composite AV cables, the yellow, white, and red cables that come bundled with the system. This is the lowest common denominator for image quality on pretty much anything you're likely to own. There is a solution to this problem in the form of upscalers for use with component cables, but those are not cheap. These things often go for more than a PS2, so obviously not everyone has the income to drop on such an expensive solution for a console they already own. So after you skip out on rent and you go with an upscaler instead, now you can play games with good image quality without problems on your modern TV. This is a pretty good solution, but not everyone has the bread to drop on something like that. Especially when we're talking about high-end upscalers like the RetroTink 5X. I'm sorry, that's just no. And that's just the PS2. I don't even know much else about the other consoles like the N64 or GameCube, but what I do know is that GameCube component cables cost an arm and a leg. This is one of the reasons why I like the original Xbox so much. It only does a minimum of 480i, so it works on my modern TV through component with no trouble. Consoles this old are also prone to hardware failures as well. I get that most of the time it's not a difficult fix, but I am not a big fan of looking after a console like it's a sketchy used car. As much as I enjoy my old consoles, it's a big pain in the ass when something like this goes wrong. Because of all of this, a lot of people tend to turn towards emulation to play certain games. Emulator devs have way more passion than these corpos, yet aren't really getting paid outside of maybe a few Patreon donations. They do it for the love of the art itself, while the big three console manufacturers just whip up a basic emulator quicker than a burger at McDonald's, causing problems with a lot of games. And due to the nature of how they implement compatibility with these games, licensing becomes a problem and they have to get approval for each game to be playable on the new console. Compare that with the PS2, Wii, and even now with the PS5 and Series X, which all supported each disc from the previous console with no licensing required. This kind of moves the topic towards accessibility of a lot of games. Whether it be region locking, exclusivity deals, or high secondhand prices, certain games are just tough to get a hold of, even ones that aren't even that old. An infamous example of a game trapped in one region is Mother 3. It's practically a meme in the Nintendo community, but Nintendo refuses to release the game in the West despite massive demand for it. They've put Mother 3 content in a bunch of different Smash Bros. Games, but haven't even released it officially outside of Japan. An example of exclusivity becoming a bump in the road is the Bayonetta series. The first Bayonetta is playable on basically every 7th and 8th generation platform you can imagine. That is 7 different ports, and the game is also playable on PS5 and Series X through backwards compatibility. The sequels, Bayonetta 2 and 3, are locked to Nintendo consoles. That means if you played Bayo 1 on a console that isn't Nintendo and you want to play the rest, you're either going to have to drop hundreds on new hardware or emulate them if you're on PC. And as for secondhand prices, do not even get me started. Since around 2021 or so, a bunch of millionaire douchebags have been hyping up game collecting as the next big profitable thing, influencing prices on games that have sold millions and treating games like collectible sports cards. Here's the thing, you can do whatever you want with whatever you buy. You don't have to collect games and play them too. But doing this shit and manipulating the market, which is a crime by the way, is just ruining it for people who want to own the games they actually enjoy playing. Seriously, what the fuck are these prices? I get that some games become expensive because they end up garnering praise after they've gone out of print, a prime example being Door to Phantomile, but Paper Mario Thousand Year Door should not be this high. Certain resellers can also go eat a cock. This story actually happened to me while I was writing this video. To keep it short, I bought a game on eBay for about $20. The seller canceled my order claiming it was out of stock, but this fucking cretin listed it again for $200. I sent him a message asking why he would lie to me like that and I got no response. This is where ROM downloading comes into play. Emulation and ROM downloading may not be one and the same, but they are heavily associated with another. The whole stigma that emulation is illegal is factually wrong, but the belief of it being illegal stems from people linking it to ROM downloading. ROM downloading, yeah, it's blatantly illegal. It's software piracy, nothing more, nothing less. However, you're not really going to get in trouble for doing it. Law enforcement has way better things to worry about than someone downloading a ROM for Poo Poo Simulator 69. As for the morality of it, that's a touchy subject. Is it immoral to download a ROM of Doom when John Carmack literally released the source code online, allowing anybody to download and compile it? What about games that are so rare that it's extremely unlikely for you to actually get a physical copy? I'm not just talking about expensive games like Disney Basketball or Godzilla, I'm talking shit like Hong Kong 97. Only a handful of physical copies have ever been documented. You're really gonna give somebody a hard time for illegally downloading a game they'll likely never come across in person? What about the majority of legacy titles that aren't even being sold by the original publishers anymore in their original unaltered forms? Sure, you could buy a physical copy if it's not that expensive, but that money isn't going to the company who made the game. That's instead going to the online seller who owned that copy in the first place. Buying a game secondhand and downloading a ROM off the internet will lead to the same outcome. You now have it and the publisher has not received a cent. There's also a good chance that if a game does come back, it's a remake. It's not the original version of the game. It was rebuilt from scratch to remain faithful to the original, but playing the game itself is a much different experience, and 9 times out of 10, that's the only version readily available to a majority of people. I've made a whole video covering the situation about Door to Phantomile and how its remake on the Wii completely butchered the experience. It's my most popular video to date, so go check that out if you're curious about the details. But that is just one example out of many. Anybody here remember Earthworm Jim HD? What was originally a quirky little run-and-gun platformer with weird gameplay elements and impressively smooth character animation had its style completely replaced with subpar art and missing animation frames. Oh yeah, and instead of making their own assets, they stole fan art from the internet. Battle for Bikini Bottom Rehydrated made the gameplay slower, introduced a bunch of glitches, and couldn't even get the show's cast to re-record voice lines. Pac-Man World Repack swapped out Pac-Man's family due to legal reasons, changed boss fights, made the Power Pellet turn Pac-Man into a giant, and added a QuickTime event to the end of the game. Remakes are cool and a novel concept, but as a method of making old games accessible, it's a joke. Regardless of if you think a remake is superior or not, it's not a replacement for the original and it never will be. Not in a million years. Imagine if the film industry didn't bother re-releasing old classics because a remake got released. Imagine if Tim Burton's Planet of the Apes or Disney's live-action Mulan were your only options. So, the consoles themselves are starting to show their age, official solutions on modern consoles are quick and dirty, most games aren't being re-released in the first place, certain titles are unaffordable for most consumers, and full remakes aren't true to the originals. Welcome to the emulator-free retro gaming hobby. Doesn't it just sound like a blast? But, if anything, it's just more reasons why I love unofficial emulation. Passionate individuals with free time on their hands do what rich corporations wouldn't do for money. The effort put into some of these emulators is unreal. Dolphin, DuckStation, Mupen, Yuzu, what have you are all exceptional in their features, compatibility, and ease of use. Don't get me wrong, they're not perfect, but in a sea of low-effort re-releases and high game prices, I just think they're neat. Come on, some of these even strive to fix flaws of the original hardware. For example, DuckStation has a setting that actually tries to mitigate texture warping, which is the shimmying environments you see in a lot of PlayStation games, and it's fucking insane. Like, how is this real? People will pass them off as a gateway to piracy, but get off your high horse and let others play games the way they want to. The 5th and 6th generations specifically are home to some of the greatest games ever made, and a lot of the library just isn't easily accessible on modern consoles. That, and not everyone is willing to go through the headache of making these elderly consoles work on your modern TV. I honestly think we're better off with unofficial emulation as opposed to shoddy re-releases because the quality you can get with it will probably never be matched. Why should I wait for Nintendo to make a shitty port of Chibi Robo for the Switch, a game going for hundreds of dollars online, when I can just boot it up on Dolphin right now? Look, I'm not that filthy of a pirate. If a game I'm looking for is readily available for me to purchase, I'll probably buy it. If I think it's too expensive, I'll wait for a discount. But for a game that's only available secondhand at an absurd price, I'll just download it. You are not hurting a soul by pirating Chibi Robo because Nintendo refuses to sell it nowadays. Do not let people convince you otherwise. Emulation is simply a gateway to accessibility, and even if it's basically intertwined with ROM downloading, don't let it ruin it for you if you care that much about it for some reason. Emulation is entirely possible using your own copies of the games. After all, those ROMs online have to come from somewhere, right? And if you like your hardware the way it is, that's okay too. I also like original hardware and physical collecting, but can we stop this emulation stigma? Who actually cares if people download ROMs of 20-year-old games? Does that really make you so mad? In conclusion, I'm happy with my emulators. They may not be perfect, but I think they're really awesome. I'm not going to sit around and wait for a mediocre remaster. I'm going to play the game on Dolphin. And in some cases, I would not have it any other way. Retro gaming is something I'm a really big fan of.